Your reminder to question the abuse of the word super in 16-bit game titles on episode 14 of Super NES Works. You'll notice across the platforms I've been covering in these video features that console launch lineups tend to share certain features and traits. For Nintendo, there's usually something to do with Mario, and over in Japan you'll always get some sort of shogi or mahjong game. But most of all, what you get are sports titles. Super Bases Loaded here is the first traditional sports game for the Super NES, arriving a month after the console's debut in the US, and it's pretty much what it says on the box. Well, almost. The full and proper title of this game is Ryan Sandberg Plays Super Bases Loaded, but I couldn't find any actual evidence of a Sandberg endorsement inside the game itself. In fact, there's no evidence of any connection to actual Major League Baseball here. Aside from the box front endorsement of a single player, Jaleco clearly didn't make any effort to lock up the league or Players Association's licenses. You're given a handful of teams to play as and against, such memorable favorites as the Boston Buzzards and the Atlanta Amoebas, starring beloved players like Smirko, Shab, and Quarb, the giants of the game. If these options aren't enough for you, you can also play as the Edit Team, a roster of blank slates you get to name and define yourself. While mildly amusing, this process takes a little more time than it's necessarily worth, and there's no way to record the team you create. But really, why should there be? Super Bases Loaded doesn't have a career mode, or even a pennant race. Instead, it operates around a unique and somewhat odd premise for a baseball title: the quest to play a perfect game. I guess I can sort of see where that comes from. The concept of a perfect game is sort of baseball's holy grail. Don't give up any hits, walk anyone, make any errors, etc. It's sort of the baseball dream. And that's the one thing you're supposed to do here in Super Bases Loaded. Every game you play is graded, assuming that you win, and once you earn a perfect grade, you're pitted against a more skilled team to do the same all over again. Supposedly, once you earn your second perfect grade against the advanced team, the staff credits roll. I can't speak to this myself because I lack the skill and patience, not to mention interest in baseball, to take on such an arduous task. Because really, Super Bases Loaded, for all its more detailed graphics and realistic presentation, doesn't do much that you didn't see back in, say, Nintendo's 1983 rendition of baseball for NES and Famicom. The visuals may look more grown-up than the NES Famista style of chubby short dudes running around the diamond, but functionally Super Bases Loaded doesn't change all that much about the genre. The biggest revision this game offers to the baseball format is supposedly a somewhat detailed physics model for pitching. Although I didn't really see any difference here from 8-bit baseball sims myself, Giant Bomb's write-up of the game claims Super Bases Loaded includes a, quote, variable physics engine that accounts for the timing, bat, and pitch speed, as well as completion of swing and registered statistics for both the batter and pitcher. That all sounds well and good, but I'm not convinced it really has any effect on how Super Bases Loaded actually plays. After playing several games against different teams, I found the experience more or less identical to NES Baseball, the original Bases Loaded for NES, and other similar titles of the era. Still, the game seems fairly well regarded among baseball fans of a certain age, although the online reviews I found praise it for the things you see in every old baseball sim. Pitchers become tired and have to be replaced. You can apply English to a pitch with different button combinations, that sort of thing. We saw all of those features in Bases Loaded for Game Boy, which shipped in the US more than a year before Super Bases Loaded. And speaking of that game, as with all the Bases Loaded titles, Super Bases Loaded comes to us from publisher Jaleco, with the heavy lifting having been performed by secretive ghost developer Tosei. And as with Bases Loaded for Game Boy, Super Bases Loaded didn't technically belong to the same series as the NES Bases Loaded, at least in Japan. The original Bases Loaded was called Moero Pro Yakyu in Japan, roughly Fiery Spirited Pro Baseball. That eventually evolved into the shortened Moe Pro Yakyu. Bases Loaded for Game Boy began life as the completely unrelated Baseball Kids. While this game appears to have been intended as something of a Moe Pro offshoot, Super Professional Baseball. It's kind of a weird mess of names and design specifics, but Jaleco kept things simple in the US by just branding all their baseball games Bases Loaded. And really, Super Professional Baseball seems to have everything in common with Bases Loaded 3, which was Moe Pro Yakyu 90 in Japan. Both games share the same pitching view, of course, a behind-the-pitcher's shoulder perspective that emphasizes the game's natural player proportions versus the tiny chunkers of Famista and its ilk. This makes for a fast-paced game since the camera angle reduces the pixel distance between the pitcher and plate compared to other entries in the genre, and results in a sensation of speed during the pitching process. The lack of on-screen display clutter helps too. If Super Bases Loaded does anything right, it's the way it minimizes the friction of the batting process for both sides and keeps the game brisk and short. But what really connects Super Bases Loaded to Bases Loaded 3, besides the Ryan Sandberg cover endorsement is the inverted fielding scheme they share in common. Like other baseball sims, the camera perspective shifts to a macro overview of the stadium once the batter hits the ball. Unlike most previous baseball video games though, Super Bases Loaded places home plate at the top of the field perspective rather than at the bottom. NES Baseball, Famista, and even the first two Bases Loaded games gave players a view of the field from a high vantage point that appeared to hover directly behind home plate. But Super Bases Loaded follows on from Bases Loaded 3 and places the field camera somewhere in the bleachers between right and center fields. It's a little disorienting at first, but it makes sense. Bases Loaded games, whatever their original Japanese titles, have always set themselves apart by placing the batting viewpoint behind the pitcher rather than behind the batting box. The reversed fielding view simply keeps perspective consistent between the two phases of the game. It works reasonably well here, with fielding controls working more or less the same as in any other baseball sim, just, backward from the usual. Once you get used to that change though, the only real difference between Super Bases Loaded and its 8-bit counterpart comes down to visuals. Yeah, there's supposedly some sort of advanced physics system at play, but in practice this amounts to a fancier version of NES baseball games. The biggest practical addition is the custom team mode, even though that has less bearing here than you might hope. While you can tweak your player stats, the game appears to adjust AI competitors to match. I tested out 2 standard teams in the CPU versus CPU exhibition mode, followed by an edit team with all stats maxed out as high as they go, and the result was basically the same. The standard teams played a neck-and-neck low-scoring game. The supercharged edit team racked up insane scores, but so did their rivals. So it's hard to see any real advantage to making use of edit mode unless you just want a temporary team staffed by, say, Retronauts regulars. Given the popularity of baseball video games in the US, it's hardly surprising to see one show up so early in the Super NES's life. And considering how well Bases Loaded fared on NES, it's definitely no surprise that a Bases Loaded game, more or less, would be the first to hit Super NES. Although Super Bases Loaded contains some interesting elements, like the goofy team names and the edit mode, it's kind of hard to recommend it against the rest of the Super NES's extensive baseball library. The expectation to play a perfect game feels like an arbitrary and extremely artificial requirement. And the lack of a more traditional pennant race, not to mention the lack of any sort of save or password feature, keeps Super Bases Loaded from having any real longevity. It's okay as a brisk pick-up-and-play baseball game, but wasn't the point of 16-bit hardware that it could offer deeper, more fulfilling experiences than 8-bit consoles? Super Bases Loaded definitely feels like Bases Loaded, but does it feel super? Next on Super NES Works, we question the use of the superlative Ultra, too.